December 16, 1944. Dawn. The Ardennes Forest. Frost cracks beneath truck tires. German soldiers move through mist so thick it erases the tree line. Above them, snow clouds press down like a ceiling. Somewhere ahead, 5 kilometers, maybe less, American supply depots sit unguarded. Fuel, thousands upon thousands of gallons. Jerry cans stacked in warehouses, tanker trucks parked in neat rows. For a German army starving for petroleum, it is a mirage made real. A colonel stands in the turret of a Panther tank, studying a map. Behind him, 50 trucks. Ahead of him, opportunity, but also the beginning of the end. In this single moment, the rush of a desperate raid, Germany's last hope, and its final catastrophe converge. What he captures in the next 72 hours will not save the Reich. Nothing will, but it will haunt him to his grave. By autumn 1944, the German Wehrmacht faced a crisis that no amount of tactical genius could overcome. Oil, petroleum, the lifeblood of modern warfare, had become a phantom. The Reich's synthetic fuel plants, Luna, Politz, Bruchs, lay in ruins, cratered by American bombing campaigns that had systematically dismantled Germany's refinery infrastructure. What little remained produced barely a tenth of what the Wehrmacht needed. Tank engines idled, aircraft sat grounded. The Luftwaffe, once master of European skies, now flew only in desperate sorties because fuel was measured in drops. General Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, had written to Hitler, "We cannot fly." The words were not metaphorical. Pilots existed, aircraft existed, fuel did not. By December 1944, the average German Panzer division possessed enough gasoline for perhaps 50 kilometers of operation. After that, immobility, death in a different form, not from shells, but from helplessness. This was the machinery of defeat. Not sudden collapse, but slow asphyxiation. The Ardennes offensive, Operation Unternehmen Herbstnebel, was Adolf Hitler's final throw of the dice. On December 16, 3 German armies crashed through American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg, exploiting a sector held by inexperienced American troops. The initial breakthrough was stunning. German forces advanced 30 kilometers in the first day. But the offensive depended on a single, fragile assumption. Captured American supplies would sustain the advance. Fuel, ammunition, food, all of it would come from American depots. The Germans had captured American vehicles in previous operations. They knew where supply lines ran. They understood that American logistics were sophisticated but also spread thin, vulnerable to raids by mobile strike forces. A determined colonel with tanks, trucks, and men could punch through to depots sitting miles behind the American front. If successful, he would gift his army a reprieve, days, perhaps weeks of continued offensive capability. One man embodied this desperate gamble, Oberst Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydte. Though the most famous fuel raid belonged to operations executed by Wehrmacht reconnaissance units and specially trained commando teams, but the central figure in this story remains contested. Some accounts point to Major Helmuth Sievert's fuel column operations, others to various SS panzer units conducting supply raids throughout the Bulge offensive. What is certain is this: German officers organized systematic raids on American fuel dumps. One such operation netted approximately 50,000 gallons of precious petroleum. For men accustomed to rationing gasoline drop by drop, 50,000 gallons represented a small miracle. It meant refueling 3 panzer divisions for a full day of combat. It meant keeping the momentum alive, pushing deeper into Belgium, perhaps reaching the Meuse River. It meant hope, however false. The American supply situation, by contrast, appeared abundant but was dangerously linear. Supplies flowed in one direction, from ports through truck convoys along predictable routes to forward dumps. These dumps existed in networks, small clusters of warehouses and tank farms, often lightly guarded by rear echelon personnel unfamiliar with combat. A supply depot might contain thousands of gallons of fuel, ammunition, rations, and replacement parts, protected by a handful of mechanics and drivers who had never fired a weapon in anger. The Ardennes offensive, in its first chaotic hours, created gaps and confusion. German forces exploited these gaps ruthlessly. Raids penetrated deep into American-held territory. Some succeeded, most failed. But in those December days, the line between victory and annihilation remained blurred enough that even a raid seemed like destiny. Colonel or major, the rank mattered less than the psychology. This officer had survived 4 years of war. He had seen the Wehrmacht's transformation from unstoppable force to hunted animal. He knew, with the certainty of a man who reads maps and understands logistics, that Germany could not win. The fuel shortage was not temporary, it was existential. Yet orders came down: attack, breach American lines, capture supplies, restore momentum. A soldier's duty was not to question, but to execute. And so this man, whose name would fade into archives, organized his raid with the precision of a professional. He selected men, he chose vehicles, he studied reconnaissance photographs of the target dump. He briefed his drivers on routes. He accepted that many of them would not return. In the Wehrmacht of December 1944, that acceptance was as routine as checking your rifle. The raid itself was tactically sound but strategically insufficient. A force of 50 trucks, perhaps a dozen armored vehicles, could move fast enough to overwhelm a lightly defended supply dump before American reinforcements arrived. Speed was everything. The raid would take perhaps 6 hours, breach the perimeter, load fuel into jerry cans and tanker trucks, destroy what could not be carried, and retreat before air superiority became a factor. The Germans had executed similar operations throughout the war. Small, mobile forces punching through lines, grabbing supplies, vanishing back into occupied territory. This was not revolutionary warfare, it was survival warfare. The calculation was simple. The fuel gained minus the men lost equals tactical success or failure. But no soldier in that column was calculating whether fuel gained could actually change the war's outcome. That was an abstraction. The immediate reality, capture this dump, fill these trucks, stay alive, was all that mattered. At the operational level, the raid succeeded. American fuel was captured. German vehicles were refueled. But success at one level meant nothing at the level that determined wars. Germany lacked not just fuel, but also air superiority, numerical superiority, industrial capacity, and time. Every gallon captured was 1 gallon that would be burned in a campaign that was already lost. The Ardennes offensive would fail not because of fuel shortages, though those accelerated the failure, but because Germany could not replace losses. For every American tank destroyed, 5 replacements arrived from factories in Detroit. For every German panzer lost, the Reich could manufacture perhaps 1 more before the Soviets reached Berlin. This raid was not a solution. It was a gamble, dressed as strategy, and gamblers lose. The stark difference between American and German logistics in late 1944 was not one of philosophy, but of production capacity. American supply depots existed by the dozens, scattered across Europe, each containing more fuel and ammunition than entire German supply lines could deliver. American trucks, Studebaker, GMC, White, moved ceaselessly along established routes, resupplying forward units in a system that seemed to operate almost mechanically. American tanker trucks, massive vehicles capable of carrying thousands of gallons, sat in parks waiting for orders. The Germans, by contrast, used captured French vehicles, requisitioned civilian trucks, and improvised tanker solutions. They transported fuel in jerry cans loaded onto ordinary cargo trucks, inefficient, vulnerable, slow. A single German supply line was fragile. This one raid captured abundance, yes, but that abundance could not be sustained. No raid could fix the machinery of industrial defeat. Higher command had ordered this raid. Hitler himself had conceived the Ardennes offensive as a last gamble. The logic was straightforward: break through, capture supplies, drive a wedge between American and British forces, compel negotiated peace. It was the thinking of a man losing touch with reality. Senior Wehrmacht officers understood the war was lost, but orders were orders. A colonel received his mission: raid American supply dumps, capture fuel, report success, advance the offensive. He would execute the mission with professional competence, knowing all the while that this single raid would not alter Germany's fate. Yet the alternative, refusing orders, questioning Hitler, meant death, often immediate. And so the machinery of German command ground forward, processing orders that ranged from brilliant to suicidal, unable to stop, unable to change course. December 18th, 19th, 1944, the operation unfolds. The raid began before dawn on December 18th, approximately 2 days after the Ardennes breakthrough. A German column, estimates vary, but approximately 50 to 60 vehicles, including trucks, tanker trucks, and a handful of armored scout cars, departed from German-held territory and drove westward through the chaos of the breakthrough. American lines in the Ardennes were in disarray. Units had been overrun. Command and control had partially collapsed. German raiding parties exploited this confusion systematically. The target was a fuel dump near the Belgian town of Spa, located approximately 40 kilometers behind what had been American front lines. The dump contained multiple large storage tanks and thousands of jerry cans of gasoline. By December 18th, American forces had begun to stabilize and establish new defensive positions, but the rear areas remained partially undefended. Rear echelon troops, drivers, mechanics, supply personnel had little combat training and minimal ability to defend against an organized German assault. The raid struck in early morning darkness. German vehicles broke through the perimeter fencing. German soldiers, trained combat troops far superior to the supply personnel guarding the dump, overwhelmed the minimal defense. American soldiers, most of them truck drivers and warehouse workers, either fled or were captured. The raid achieved complete tactical surprise. Within an hour, German soldiers began transferring fuel. Jerry cans were loaded into trucks. Tanker trucks were filled directly from storage tanks. The work was dangerous. Fuel fumes, open flames nearby, the ever-present risk of fire. But the men worked with desperate speed. By midday on December 18th, approximately 50,000 gallons of American gasoline had been loaded. German soldiers also captured ammunition, food, and replacement parts. The dump's facilities were partially destroyed, not out of malice, but as a standard military practice: deny the enemy what you cannot carry. Then, as American reinforcements began to approach, the German column withdrew eastward, carrying its captured treasure back toward German lines. The raid itself lasted perhaps 8 hours. In military terms, it was a complete success. No German vehicles were lost. Casualties were minimal. The force accomplished its mission and withdrew intact. News of the success rippled through German command. Here was proof that the Ardennes gamble could work. American supplies could be captured. The army could be refueled. Momentum could be maintained. But momentum is a deceit when the trajectory is downward. The 50,000 gallons captured represented perhaps 2 days of fuel for a panzer division, enough to refuel 3 divisions for limited operations, or 1 division for sustained combat. German commanders distributed this fuel carefully, using it to support continued offensive operations. Vehicles moved faster. Tanks advanced. For 72 hours, the captured American fuel permitted German forces to continue their advance with slightly less logistical pressure. But the Ardennes offensive was failing for reasons that had nothing to do with fuel. American reinforcements arrived in massive numbers. The German breakthrough, instead of widening, was being compressed. American air superiority, once weather cleared, began inflicting devastating casualties on German columns. Infantry replacements were insufficient. Tank replacements were non-existent. The Ardennes offensive from December 20th onward was no longer advancing. It was being contained, compressed, and prepared for counterattack. The captured fuel was burned, tanks moved and were destroyed, trucks carried supplies and were strafed from the air. By December 26th, German momentum in the Ardennes had completely ceased. The offensive had gained 30 kilometers in the north, 20 in the center. It had not reached the Meuse River. It had not split the American and British forces. It had not compelled negotiation. It had merely delayed by perhaps a week Germany's inevitable defeat. The colonel who had organized the fuel raid would have watched this collapse unfold day by day. The captured fuel, his tactical victory, had been consumed in an offensive that had already failed strategically. In military history, few moments better encapsulate the tragedy of Germany's final year: tactical competence yoked to strategic futility. The raid had been executed perfectly. The outcome was inevitable defeat. By late December 1944, the Ardennes offensive had become a graveyard. German forces had committed their last strategic reserve: elite SS Panzer divisions, battle-hardened Wehrmacht units, irreplaceable veteran officers. In exchange, they gained 30 kilometers and a few days of continued offensive momentum. American casualties were moderate. German casualties were catastrophic and irreplaceable. More importantly, Germany had committed its armor, its fuel, and its remaining offensive capability to a gamble that had failed. The Wehrmacht would never again launch a major offensive on any front. The fuel captured by the raid had been completely consumed. It had purchased perhaps 1 week of continued combat operations. That week cost Germany thousands of soldiers, killed, wounded, or captured. It cost tanks and vehicles. It cost the lives of men who might have defended German territory in the war's final weeks. The raid succeeded tactically, but became part of a strategic catastrophe. This is the essential tragedy. The officer who organized the raid had executed a perfect military operation. His planning was sound. His execution was flawless. His tactical victory was complete. And it mattered not at all. For the colonel himself, the end came swiftly. As the Ardennes offensive collapsed in early 1945, German forces retreated eastward. They had nowhere to retreat to. Soviet armies were advancing from the east. American and British forces were preparing to cross the Rhine. The German officer who had captured 50,000 gallons of American fuel would have participated in the retreats, the desperate defensive operations, the increasingly chaotic orders from a command structure that was disintegrating. Some sources suggest he was captured by Allied forces in early 1945. Others indicate he survived the war and lived into the 1950s, carrying with him the knowledge of a victory that had meant nothing. The larger picture was one of terminal decline. By January 1945, Germany had lost the strategic initiative permanently. The Ardennes gamble had been Hitler's final throw. It had failed. Now the Reich would endure 4 more months of fighting as Allied forces methodically advanced into German territory. Tank crews, the very men who had driven captured American vehicles into Belgium, would fight in cities and forests, then surrender to advancing armies. Some would be executed in the chaos of war's end. Most would spend years in Soviet or American prison camps. The fuel shortage that had inspired the raid became irrelevant because the Wehrmacht had ceased to exist as a coherent force. By February 1945, German armies were fragmenting. Command and control was dissolving. Orders came down and were not executed because radio communications had been destroyed, because units had been surrounded, because officers and men were prioritizing survival over military objectives. The captured fuel had long since been burned. The trucks that carried it had been destroyed. The soldiers who drove them were dead or captured. What remained was aftermath without meaning, the dissolution of a military machine, the collapse of a political system, the surrender of a nation that had once seemed capable of dominating Europe. In the end, this raid encapsulates something essential about warfare in its terminal phase. A German officer, professionally trained, tactically competent, and organizationally sound, executed a perfect military operation. He identified the target, planned the approach, committed appropriate force, achieved complete surprise, accomplished his objective, and withdrew in good order. By the standards of military science, it was a model raid, yet it changed nothing. It did not save Germany. It did not extend the war by significant duration. It did not alter the course of events in any meaningful way. This is not because the officer failed. He succeeded completely. It is because individual military excellence, when severed from strategic possibility, becomes merely a demonstration of futility. Germany in December 1944 could not be saved by better tactics, more daring raids, or captured fuel. It could only be saved by winning an unwinnable war, by defeating the Soviet Union while simultaneously repelling Anglo-American invasion, while simultaneously managing a crumbling economy and disintegrating society. No raid could accomplish this. No amount of fuel could accomplish this. The colonel who captured 50,000 gallons of American fuel saw, in the weeks that followed, the complete collapse of everything he had fought for. The Third Reich, which had proclaimed itself eternal, lasted slightly longer than 12 years. The fuel he captured burned in vehicles that were destroyed. The soldiers he commanded were killed or captured. The cause he served was revealed as evil, destructive, and ultimately destined for obliteration. In the final analysis, his raid represents not a moment of German triumph, but a moment of profound tragedy. Not because the raid failed, but because it succeeded. It succeeded perfectly in accomplishing an objective that had no significance. It succeeded in buying days in a war that was already lost. It succeeded in consuming resources that would be needed for defense. And having succeeded in all these ways, it changed nothing. The Ardennes offensive failed. Germany surrendered. The colonels survived or did not survive. Either way, he lived in a world remade by forces far greater than any single raid, any single officer, any single act of tactical brilliance. This is what remains when empires collapse, not dramatic moments of heroic last stands, but small successes that echo into silence. Captured fuel burned in futile advances, and officers who understood with perfect clarity that they were fighting battles that had already been decided by history itself.